Hello students and welcome back to American Federal Government. As always, I'm your instructor, Connor Alford. And in this video, we're going to begin to talk about how Americans select their leaders. So, we're talking about elections and voting in the United States, and we've got a series of 6 learning objectives that we need to satisfy in order to explain how we as Americans select our leaders. The first of these learning objectives asks for you to explain what an election is, what it entails, how it is distinct from a referendum or an initiative, and why elections are so important. The second learning objective asks for you to compare voter turnout in the United States to turnout in other countries, and to explain current and historic trends in voter turnout for our country. So you need to be able to tell us how our voter turnout compares to other countries and how it compares to where it's been at in the past. And you also need to be able to explain why we see so much variation both across space and over time in things like the proportion of voters who are actually casting ballots. The third learning objective asks for you to detail how the framers designed the presidential selection process and some of the arguments both for and against the system, while the fourth learning objective asks for you to explain how the framers designed Senate and House elections, how these are different, and why. The fifth learning objective asks for you to discuss different types of representation that the framers had in mind when they designed the electoral systems for each of the 2 chambers of Congress. And of course, you already know that those 2 chambers are the House of Representatives and the Senate. Finally, our sixth learning objective asks for you to discuss the issue of gerrymandering. You should be able to tell me what it is, where it comes from, why it's possible, what parts of government it affects, if any, why it matters, and what some of the strategies that might be used to actually gerrymander a district happen to be. Let's get started with that first learning objective. Towards this end, the very first thing you need to do is tell me what an election entails. And I'm willing to bet that most of you could probably do this without any further lecture. But just in case, understand that an election is simply a process in which voters choose who will represent them in government. In other words, it is a system in which people can come together to decide who decides when it's time for the government to do things like make the rules governing day-to-day life, determine how high or how low are taxes to be, how to allocate public resources, so on and so forth. Now, we're going to find that elections are very important for a variety of reasons. But one thing that I want to note right off the bat is that they're not the only way that you could give people a voice in government. They're probably the most familiar to those of us living here in the United States, but they're not the only option, or even necessarily the most democratic and direct option available. See, elections do give us a voice at the table by allowing us to select our policymakers. But they don't empower us to directly decide which policies pass or fail when it's time for things like Congress to decide how to vote on an upcoming piece of legislation. That's not the way that democracy has historically worked. Historically speaking, democracy has taken shape in one of 2 primary ways. Or perhaps another way to say this, a less controversial way to say this, is that there are at least 2 main ways that you can structure a government system in order to give people a voice. The first is to adopt what the framers adopted, a republic, a type of representative democracy. On the other hand, the other option is to go with what we saw in places like ancient Athens, what we sometimes call Athenian or classical democracy, but that I want you to write down as direct democracy. In a direct democracy, the people don't elect their government decision makers. Instead, when they vote, they're voting on the decisions themselves. They don't select policymakers, they select policies. And the primary way that you can go about doing that is not through an election, because remember, an election is a process in which the people or members of a group or society come together to decide who holds public office, to select office holders, to choose on policymakers rather than the policies themselves. But there are other options. For example, at the state level, many states, like Oklahoma, for instance, have an initiative process which allows citizens to draft and propose new laws or even, in some cases, constitutional amendments. Usually this involves collecting a number of signatures, although the rules vary from one place to the next. But in the majority of states, If you can get enough people to sign on to a petition saying that they would like a law that you have written to be passed, then you can send that to the appropriate government agencies. And those agencies will make sure that this proposed policy winds up in the form of a state question. That's a proposed policy that will appear on the ballots of voters. Those voters will then have the opportunity to decide whether to pass or fail that policy. So in an initiative, the voters draft a law, and then the voters vote to decide whether that law passes or fails. In many of these states, though not necessarily all, we have a similar process called a referendum. A referendum is also a vote in which citizens approve or reject a particular law, constitutional amendment, or other government action. But in this case, that law, government action, or constitutional amendment isn't going to be proposed by the voters. Instead, it's going to be proposed to the voters by their legislators, who are, at least in our case, generally going to be elected officials. So what's the big difference between, say, an election and a referendum or an initiative? Well, very simply, in an election, you choose a person or a party, a group of people who will be responsible for handling day-to-day government on your behalf. Whereas in initiatives and referenda, you're not voting on people or for or against a person. You're voting on policies. You are voting whether to approve or reject a proposed law. Now, I bring this up first and foremost because for this first learning objective, you need to be able to tell me why elections are important, why they matter, why we're spending so much time talking about them. And one of the major reasons why elections matter is that they make modern democracy possible on the scale of a modern nation state. Now, when I say the term nation state, what I want you to think about for our purposes here today is country. So imagine a country, the United States, Canada, Germany, Mexico. Doesn't necessarily matter which one you've got in mind. But if you were to go and Google, what is the population of such and such country? You're going to find that we're dealing with very large groups of people. There are millions and millions and millions of individuals who cohabitate together in even a very small country in the modern world. And when we start to talk about very large countries like the United States, those numbers skyrocket. And so what we're going to find is that if you want a country that is democratic, or in other words, that gives people a voice in government, you are not going to be able to do this with initiatives and referenda. It's simply not practical to expect all of the millions and millions of people in any given country to come together and decide what to do every time the government needs to make a decision. Now, if you were to try this, then you would have adopted that classical Athenian type of democracy that we call a direct democracy. And for the framers, by the way, that's the only form of democracy we can talk about. If you go and you read the Federalist Papers, when the framers tell you that they don't want to create a democracy, what they're trying to communicate is that they reject a direct democracy in which you have a group of people who come together and decide what they are going to do as a group by voting every time a collective decision needs to be made. The framers were deeply suspicious of this type of system. They saw it as impracticable. They saw it as dangerous, as a path to mob rule, what Thomas Jefferson called two wolves and a sheep coming together to vote on what's for dinner. And so instead they decided to adopt what they called a republic. Now, a republic is distinct from a democracy, or if you prefer, a direct democracy, because at least in some sense of the term, a republic is a type of democracy. More specifically, a type of representative democracy. In a representative democracy, you don't generally have initiatives and referendum. Instead, the primary way you give people a voice in government is by allowing them to select their decision makers. They don't vote on the decisions, they vote on decision makers. Then, those decision makers are responsible for handling day-to-day government and policy making on the behalf of their voters. And every now and again, we're going to have another round of elections during which the voters can review that decision maker's job performance, and if they think that he or she has done a good job, they can vote him or her out of office. Or if they think they've done a bad job, you can flip that. The voters can decide whether to keep somebody because they've done a good job or fire somebody because they've either been incompetent or corrupt. Either way, elections are the primary tool for giving people a voice at the table when government needs to make a decision in a representative democracy. Now, what distinguishes a republic from other types of representative democracy, if we really want to get in the weeds, is that those elected officials, even though they were selected by popular vote, are still legally limited in what they can do. If 51% of the country got together and voted to ban the religions of the other 49%, well, their elected officials would be in a really weird situation because whether their voters wanted that or not, it's illegal under the First Amendment. If 51% of the country got together and elected a bunch of members of Congress to pass laws enslaving the other 49%, again, that's not going to fly because in a republic, winning an election doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. There are still rules that you have to follow. Okay, now tying this all back in, here's what I want you to understand about the first of our major reasons for why elections matter. If you want a voice in government on the scale of a modern nation state, you need elections. It cannot be done straight or purely through initiatives because people don't have time to get together to make every decision a government might need to make. Pick a country, any country that you would regard as representative, as a republic, or as a democracy anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter which one. I guarantee you that what you have identified is some form of representative democracy. It might be a republic, it might not, but I'll tell you that it is not going to be a direct democracy. Why? Because there are no direct democracies operating on the scale of an entire country anywhere in the modern world. It's not practical. So again, I want you to understand that elections actualize the principle of representation by making democratic or representative government feasible on the scale of a modern nation state. That's point one. Point number two, elections are the source of legitimacy and authority for governments in the Western world today. Now, to be clear, there are other sources of legitimacy and authority that we can talk about around the world. But in the West, we by and large have agreed upon this principle that we call the social contract theory of government. And the social contract theory of government tells us that the only legitimate form of government is government by the consent of the governed. So where do governments get their legal right to do things like make rules, adjudicate disputes about those rules, or execute and enforce those rules when we don't want to follow them? Where do governments get the authority to tell us what to do and then to use coercion or violence to impose physical punishments upon us if we refuse to comply? Well, they get this authority from the consent of the governed. And how do we express or withdraw consent? Well, we do this very simply by voting for or against the people in power. If you are not satisfied with the way that our country is currently being run, well, fortunately for you, this is a republic. This is a representative system, and you can fire all of those people in power. You can withdraw your consent simply by voting against them. Or conversely, if you think they're doing a great job, well, fantastic, I'm happy for you. You can go and vote so that they get to keep their jobs. But the power is in your hands because of elections. So you can consent, which means that you, or rather I should say we, the people, can authorize the government, give it the legal power and authority to legislate, administrate, and adjudicate, to exercise sovereignty, or in short, act like a government. But it's not just that elections are where Congress, for example, gets its legal authority to act as a legislative body. It's also the main reason why we, the people, broadly accept and acknowledge it when Congress engages in activities that we usually wouldn't tolerate. So, for example, by and large, we don't allow our neighbors or our employers to do things like create rules that say, if you don't give me 10% of your income, I'm going to throw you in prison. We do allow the government to do this. Now, legally speaking, we know that the government is authorized to do this because the law says that whoever wins an election gets to make these types of decisions. But the law is not all that useful unless there's popular acceptance. And that begs the question, why do we accept it when Congress tells us what to do? Why is it theft or extortion if I take your money and redistribute it, but it's taxation when Congress does so? Well, because again, we are the people who selected the members of Congress for the purpose of doing things like levying taxes. And we accept that they have the authority to do this because of that fact that we elected them. Okay, so remember, authority is a legal right to act like a government. Legitimacy is popular acceptance of that legal right. And in the Western world, both of these come from elections. And by the way, this is an important thing to keep in mind, because one thing that we have found is that when people's faith in the electoral system declines, it tends to create a crisis in the authority and ability of a government to actually operate like a government and maintain law and order in a country. And we have seen throughout the Western world, particularly in the United States, over recent years, an increase in skepticism about the integrity of electoral systems. So keep that somewhere in the back of your mind, because if people don't believe that the elections are free and fair, well, they're not going to be a very good source of legitimacy, even if they are, at least on paper, a good source of legal authority. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide is accountability. The third reason why elections are so gosh darn important is that they are the primary tool that we have to hold people in power accountable to people who aren't in power. Here's a basic principle. People in power prefer to stay in power. And so they're going to do what it takes to maintain their positions of privilege, which means that we need to find a way to hold them accountable to the people, such that if they want to achieve their goal, staying in power, they need to keep the people happy. So how do we do that? How do we ensure policies are based on citizen preferences and needs rather than the wants, needs, and interests of our political class, their friends, their family, or their financial supporters? Well, very, very easy answer to this question. Elections. People in power prefer to stay in power. And in a republic, in a representative democracy, staying in power means winning elections. Well, how do you win elections? You got to get votes. How do you get votes? You keep the people happy. You give them what they want. And if you don't, then you will be held accountable, because they can fire you. They can remove you from office. And so one important thing to understand is that elections help to hold our elected leaders accountable. Now, maybe some of these leaders are deeply benevolent and they don't need the threat of losing their job in order to do what is in the best interest or what is consistent with the wishes of their voters. But we don't generally want to be dependent upon the benevolence of people in positions of political authority. And so, elections. Think back to prior lectures where we talked about Mayhew's #1 goal of an elected official. However, one point that I want to raise here is that accountability is a two-way street. It's not just that we're holding our leaders accountable to the people. We're also holding the people accountable. Because elections, this is important, I need you to understand this, elections are a tool which we can use to facilitate a peaceful transition of power when it's time to switch from the regime or rule of one candidate or party to that of another. And elections work by co-opting potentially violent dissenters into the civic process. See, here's the thing about, again, our system. If you're deeply dissatisfied with what the people currently in power are doing, you have a way to redress your grievances without turning to violence. You can vote them out of office. Whereas if you are in Russia, if you are in North Korea, if you are in Iran, that's not really an option. If the people of Russia decide that they don't want somebody like Vladimir Putin in power, they can't just vote him out of office. Russia theoretically has elections, but they're a sham, and basically everybody knows it. And so Vladimir Putin's guaranteed to win, which means that ballots aren't a useful tool for facilitating a change in who holds power if you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. No. Where we go and gather our ballots to make a difference, you, as a Russian who wants to oust Vladimir Putin, you're going to need to start stockpiling bullets. Now, to be clear, in case there's anyone in Russia who's listening and I ever vacation there, don't want to wind up in a cell, I'm not advocating for violent resistance or upheaval. But what I am saying is that if a country doesn't have a system for removing the people in power and replacing them with somebody else peacefully, then that country has essentially made peaceful change impossible and violent change inevitable. The only way to change is through violence if you don't actually have representation in the civic process. And so again, what this means is that we're holding ourselves accountable in the methods we use for facilitating change. This helps to explain why, by and large, Americans are deeply opposed to any form of civic violence. By and large, if you decide that you're going to throw on a cow hat and storm the Capitol, or you're going to flip cars and smash windows because you don't like who won the last election, you can expect pretty universal condemnation from both sides of the aisle. Why? Because that's not how we do things here. We can express and should express our dissatisfaction through civic protests, through peaceful assembly, and most importantly, by voting. So we've held potentially violent dissenters accountable by co-opting them and integrating them into the system, by giving them a path to peacefully redress their grievances in government, and that's accountability. Elections are important because they make modern democracy possible on the scale of a nation state, because they provide Western governments with their source of legitimacy and authority, and because they hold leaders accountable while also helping to co-opt potentially violent dissenters. And that's our first learning objective. For learning objective number 2, you need to tell me a little bit about voter turnout in the United States, both compared to other countries around the world and compared to where voter turnout has been at in the past. In other words, you're going to need to be able to talk at least a little bit about voter turnout trends in American history. Since around 2008, we have seen a bit of a short-term spike in voter turnout that seems to have reached its zenith either in the 2020 or 2024 elections, when you have something like 66% of eligible voters who showed up on election day, which does give us the highest rate since around 1908. Now, it was down slightly from the 2020 66% figure to only 64% in 2024. And that's 64% of eligible voters who actually showed up to vote on election day. But even then, these rates are still higher than just about anything we have seen since the 1960s. And we are seeing similar trends in midterm elections. If you don't know, a midterm election is an election on an off year where there is no presidential candidate who appears on the ballot. So, for example, in 2020, we had a presidential election, but the president serves a 4-year term. So the president was not on the ballot in 2022. The president was on the ballot in 2024. 2020, 2024, presidential election years because there's a president on the ballot. 2022, 2026, midterm election years. No presidents on the ballot. Well, during the 2022 midterm election, for example, there was no president on the ballot, but we still got a slight majority, about 52% of eligible voters who actually participated. And that's the second highest rate in about 4 decades, exceeded only by 2018, which saw about 53%. Now, 2018, 2022, these are pretty recent years. And so the point that I'm trying to make is very simply that voter turnout has, in recent years, experienced a short-term uptick. The precise numbers are going to vary based on how you measure voter turnout. There are at least 3 methods of calculating voter participation and turnout rates. All of them start by counting the total number of voters or the total number of votes cast across a country or an election area. But once you have this number, you have 3 options. You can compare it to the voter eligible population, the people who are legally allowed to vote. You can compare it to the voting age population, the people who are legally old enough to vote, or you can compare it to the population of the people who are registered to vote. But however you calculate it, the short-term trend has been a fairly rapid and impressive spike in voter participation, and scholars debate what's causing that. But how do we stack up to other countries, and what's the long-term trend? Well, overall, our voter participation rates are pretty average when you control for factors like the size and diversity of our population and the fact that, unlike some countries, Australia, for example, voting is not mandatory but purely optional. We're in a comfortable position. We're absolutely not where we would like to be, but neither are we by any stretch of the imagination the lowest in turnout. We're somewhere firmly in the middle. We are mediocre. The real problem does not become apparent when you compare the United States to other countries. Instead, the real problem becomes apparent the moment you begin to start looking at long-term trends in voter turnout for our country. And to illustrate this, what I've done on this slide is gather a sequence of presidential election years on the left-hand side or the left-hand column of this table. And on the right-hand column, we see voter turnout rates for that year. So for example, in 1840, we saw an 80.2% turnout. In 1844, 78.9. In 1860, 81.2. In 1896, 79.3. But at around this time, voter turnout begins the longest sustained decline in the history of our country. And by 1956, we're down to 60%. This continues to drop. 1972, we go to 55.2%. 2012, 54.8%. 2024, well, we're back all the way up to 64%. Now, to be clear, that's a pretty substantial jump. To go from 54 to 64% is excellent, and we should celebrate that. But compare that 64% to where we were in the 1840s, in the 1860s, in the 1890s. If in the 1840s we saw that only about 6 out of 10 eligible voters actually cast a ballot on election day, people would panic. They would be wondering what had gone so terribly wrong. And by the way, these numbers are actually downplaying exactly how drastic this long-term decline has been. Because what we're finding is that, contrary to what you might think, voter turnout should be going up. Why should voter turnout be going up? Well, for a lot of reasons. But by and large, here are some of the major ones. First, one thing that we know tends to drive up voter participation is economics. When the economy is strong and people are relatively prosperous, they vote much more reliably. They've got more free time to do things like research, care, and think about elections and show up on election day. And as it turns out, the United States today is substantially more well off than it has been at any time in the past. You may or may not realize it, but you are living in an era of superabundance. You are the wealthiest generation of Americans to have ever lived. Now, this trend has been somewhat offset by economic disruptions due to things like war and COVID-19, but at the end of the day, we in this country walk around with thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of technology in our pockets because almost all of us have iPhones, or at least some form of cell phone. We have access to things like penicillin. The standards of living in this country are higher than they've ever been. Our luxuries are higher than they've ever been. Our spending power is higher than it has ever been. It doesn't always feel like this, but the fact of the matter is that we are definitely more influential than our predecessors, than our grandparents. We are more affluent than any generation of Americans because our economics have gone up. And yet, in spite of the fact that strong economic performance and wealth are associated with voter turnout, and the fact that we have way more wealth than any other generation of Americans at our disposal, voter participation has declined. Similarly, we find that as education goes up, the probability that you will vote will also increase. Well, we're definitely much more educated than our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and certainly more than Americans living in the 1840s, and yet again, the pattern has declined. As it becomes easier to vote, you should see people voting more. Well, we've been consistently removing de facto and de jure barriers to voting, and yet it goes down. So again, this long-term trend is disturbing, but it's also a bit puzzling. So how do we explain that puzzle? Well, first, I want to talk a little bit about the wrong way to resolve this problem. Why is voter turnout in the United States overall declining in spite of a recent uptick? We have not regained all of our lost ground, so the broad trend is still a decline. Why is voter participation in our country on the decline in spite of the fact that it's easier to vote, that we have more money, that we have more resources, that we are more affluent, so on and so forth? Well, in answering this question, one thing that you frequently see in editorial and political discussions, when you ask people what can be done to help reverse this trend on a more permanent basis, so on and so forth, is that people tend to blame some combination of what we might call de jure barriers to voting and what we might call de facto barriers to voting. De jure means by law. De facto means by fact. A de jure barrier to voting is a formal government policy. It is a rule or regulation that makes it either impossible, illegal, or difficult for you to cast a ballot on election day. Whereas a de facto barrier doesn't necessarily directly result from any formal policy or proposal, but rather from the practical realities of day-to-day life. So let's look at each of these and see why they don't actually explain why voter turnout is on the decline. Let's start with de jure barriers. Big picture, de jure barriers are a bad explanation for the ongoing decline in America's voter participation for a very simple reason. They themselves have been gradually pulled away during the same time period that voter turnout has declined. Prior to the American Civil War, if you weren't a white man, you couldn't vote. Early in our nation's history, the rules were even more stringent. Not only did you need to be a white man, you needed to be a white man with property. But we've got amendments to the United States Constitution which prohibit things like racially discriminatory voter eligibility requirements or rules which prohibit somebody from voting on the basis of their gender. We've got another amendment that lowers the age to vote from 21 to 18. And broadly speaking, legal barriers limiting people's eligibility are on the decline. And that's a problem for the de jure barrier argument because, as it turns out, eligibility requirements are one of the most important type of de jure barrier. But the requirements to be eligible to vote in the United States, I want you to understand today, are extremely minimal. Much more so than what we see in most other countries. Certainly much more so than what we have seen throughout history. Today, if you want to be a voter in the United States, here are the conditions you need to satisfy to be eligible. 1, you've got to be an adult. 2, you've got to be a citizen. And 3, you generally can't be a felon. Now, there are some exceptions. In certain states like Florida, what we're going to see is that the state has created rules allowing felons to cast votes, which might help to explain why the state of Florida, at around the time that Donald Trump was running for president, shifted from being a relatively purple swing state, where sometimes Democrats won and sometimes Republicans won, to a firmly red state, where Donald Trump and his respective challengers in 2016, 2020, and 2024 didn't even compete because they all knew who was going to win. The felons wanted descriptive representation, and so they were going to select one of their own. They voted for Donald J. Trump. But I digress. The point that I'm trying to make here is that not committing a felony, being a citizen, and being an adult are some pretty modest eligibility requirements. And so if this was the problem, then the problem should be solved. We've gotten rid of the most onerous of these burdens. These eligibility requirements are much more lenient today than they have been in the past, and they're certainly more lenient than what we see in other countries. Okay, so if it's not eligibility requirements, what other factors might be at play? Well, the other major de jure barrier that we need to talk about is the registration requirement. A registration requirement is basically a law that requires you to register as a voter before you can actually participate in an election. Well, registration requirements actually do a much better job of explaining the decline than do eligibility requirements, at least at first glance, because the timing is almost right. Voter turnout starts to decline in our country at around the time we start to adopt voter registration requirements. However, they can't really explain the problem because registering to vote today is substantially easier than it's ever been. And so again, if registration requirements were the problem should be solved. By and large, it is possible to register as a voter with very little effort. In some cases, in some states, you have election day registration, where the act of casting your ballot is essentially your registration because you can show up on election day, tell them you want to vote, and they will give you the forms you need to register and cast your ballot at the same time. Now, those states are the exception, but even in states with more onerous rules, it's a very simple and quick process. You can, by and large, do this online or at home through the mail. Or if you go to get a driver's license. One thing you're going to find is that because of something called the Motor Voter Act is that you're going to be handed a voter registration form. And this is true for not just things like your driver's license, but basically anything that involves going into a government office. And so what we're finding is that people might go, say, to get a driver's license or to fill out other government documents, and without realizing it, accidentally register to vote. If it's so easy to do that you can do it by accident, it's probably not a substantial barrier. And so the two main types of de jure barrier that we can talk about, eligibility requirements and registration requirements, are both very poor explanations for low turnout in the United States. Now, more recently, we've also been talking about voter identification laws. Voter identification laws have a long history in our states and in our country as a whole, but more and more recently, what we are finding is that our country has a debate about the impact of photo identification laws. Many states are now requiring voters to present a photo ID when they show up to vote on election day so that the individual who is working the voter booth can confirm that they are in fact who they say they are and not say someone trying to cast a fraudulent ballot or steal another person's vote or vote more than once or vote in more than one election or more than one electoral district. And there are some who have posited the possibility that these voter identification laws, which are being adopted in certain states, might reduce overall voter turnout, or, more pointedly, might reduce turnout among certain demographics. Critics of the laws tend to accuse them of having hidden racial motives and being designed to disenfranchise black voters. Well, there are some circumstantial reasons why people might be suspicious of these or any other changes to voting laws, especially in some of the states that have passed them given their history. But empirically speaking, here's the fact of the matter. There's absolutely no evidence that voter ID requirements reduce voter turnout in our country, in the states that adopt them, either overall or for African Americans or any other demographic. We have enough states that have passed these laws and had them on the books for a long enough period of time that we can see that the causal link simply isn't there. Most people, regardless of their race or ethnicity, have a driver's license or some form of government ID so that they can do things like get to work, buy prescription medicine, so on and so forth. And so, yeah, this is, again, stretching. It's just not a good explanation. And even if we ignored all of those recent studies, you don't really start to see these laws cropping up in the states until around 2014. And of course, we know that during that time period, we've seen a short-term uptick and not the general long-term decline. And so there's a timing issue. The long-term decline started like more than 100 years before we began seeing these laws. So obviously these laws aren't the particular problem. They might still be a problem depending on your opinions and perspectives, that's fine, but they don't explain voter decline. Okay, so what about de facto barriers, these sort of practical day-to-day realities that might keep people who would like to vote from actually doing so? Well, here again, the big picture is that they exist, they're real, they certainly affect certain people, but they don't explain why our voter turnout isn't better than it is compared to other countries, or why it has declined over the last century or so. And the reason they don't explain is that, again, they are very, very minimal, both compared to where they've been in the past and compared to where they're at in other countries. Some of the most common types of de facto barrier, for example, are what we call information barriers. And here, the information barriers that we are talking about are the time and energy that you have to expend conducting research before you can cast a meaningful ballot on election day. And what we're going to discover is that these practical time commitments in energy and resources are real. You do have to do research. They're certainly a lot less burdensome than they've been in the past because of things like, oh, I don't know, the internet and the fact that we walk around with cell phones in our pocket. If you wanted to find out where to vote right now, you could pull out your cell phone, use ChatGPT, use Google, and figure it out more or less at the snap of a finger, or at least at the tap of a button. That wasn't an option for Americans 100 years ago. We also find that it's not just the time you need to do research, although that's probably one of the most important. It takes time to get to your polling place. Well, the modern election bureaucracy is much more robust, and so our election locations, our polling places, tend to be closer to our houses. We have modern transportation. Planes, trains, cars, automobiles, and Ubers are all at your fingertips. And so that doesn't explain it. The bottom line then is that whether we're looking at de jure or de facto barriers, both of these have been on the decline at the same time that voter turnout has also been on the decline. And so if either were the problem should be solved. Okay, well, if it's neither de jure barriers nor de facto barriers, what actually explains the decline? Well, there are a number of things that we can talk about. We can talk about whether voters are content in the sense that they are sufficiently happy with all of the options, that they don't feel motivated enough to show up and vote, even if they tend to prefer one party to the other, or that they're so discontent that they feel their vote doesn't matter, that neither of the parties represent them, and they're going to get screwed over either way. We can talk about the possibility that the parties have polarized, the Republican Party becoming so far right and the Democrat Party becoming so far left that the majority of us who still hang out in the middle are unsatisfied. Or how they might in some ways be too similar. Whether you vote for Republicans or Democrats, our country seems to be persistently at war, for example. There hasn't been a real anti-war party in our country since around the Vietnam War era, and even then it's a little questionable. And that might lead some people who, say, are very dovish, who really don't like foreign intervention or wars in places like Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Ukraine, might not vote. But really, the fact of the matter is that there are two primary reasons why voter turnout has declined in our country. The first and single most important is that over the last century or so, century and a half or so, we have dramatically weakened political parties. Remember, a political party is an organized group of political activists who come together to rally voters and win elections. In our country, and really in any country that you can talk about, electoral organizations like political parties are the primary intermediaries responsible for getting people to show up on election day. So when they're very strong, they tend to lead to a very high voter turnout. But when you start to strip them of the tools they need to motivate people to actually show up and vote for their candidates, well, they become less well equipped for mobilizing voter turnout, and as a consequent, voter turnout goes down. Now, this does obviously have some negative consequences, because of course we know that people's participation in the electoral system is really important for some of these reasons that we've already talked about. However, it's not all as bad as it might seem at first glance. Because during the 1800s, voter turnout was high, not necessarily because Americans were more motivated to vote in and of itself for the action's own benefit, but because they were pressured to do so by political parties. In some cases, this involved, in essence, bribery. People were offered jobs in government for showing up to vote for the right candidate. In other cases, it involved coercion. If you were a, say, hotel or rather a landlord in Philadelphia, for example, during the 1800s, and you were caught voting against the party in power, or you were found not to have voted at all, you might fail your next health inspection and be told that you're no longer allowed to rent out your housing units. Your apartment complexes are going to be shut down. But if, on the other hand, you go to everyone who rents a house or occupies one of your apartment units, and you tell them, hey, we all need to show up and vote for such and such candidate with such and such party. Well, you showed up, you got your people to show up, you supported the right candidates, you're guaranteed that you're going to pass your health inspections for the foreseeable future. And so again, you're going to show up to vote, and you're going to get a bunch of other people who don't want to be homeless to vote, but they've been coerced to do it. This isn't a sign of healthy democracy, it's a sign of corruption. And so what we get are a series of reforms, specifically designed to break up these party machines, to tear down the party bosses and to weaken the political parties as a way of weeding corruption out of the system. And it works at the cost of voter turnout. The second major factor is population growth. As it turns out, it's a lot harder to get 10% of 100 people to participate than 10% of 10, or to get 10% of 1,000 as compared to 10% of 1,000,000. If you need to get 10% of 1,000 people to show up and participate in an election, well, that means you need to go out and find 100 people. It might not be easy, but given a couple of months, I'm pretty sure that basically any of us could do that. On the other hand, if you need to get 10% of 1,000,000, it's just probably not going to happen. 10% of 100 million obviously isn't possible for just one of us. So the bigger your population is, the lower the percent of that population you can expect to participate. And this is why if you go on Google and you look up a list of the countries with the highest voter turnout in the world, you're going to find that most of them tend to be very small and homogeneous. Now, our next learning objective asks for you to describe the presidential selection process at use in our country. And towards this end, we're going to need to talk about something called the Electoral College. Now, to be clear, the Electoral College is a process. It's not a university. It's not a location. It is a method of selecting who the next president of the United States will be. And the very first thing I want you to note about this process is, and this is important, there is no national popular vote to decide who the president of the United States is going to be. Instead, what we are going to find is that the presidential selection process proceeds in a series of 2 steps. The first is what we sometimes refer to as the November elections. Note that the term election is here pluralized to elections. And then the second phase is what we call the December election. Here, election is singular. Let's talk about each of these one by one, starting with the November election. During the November election, you have a series of 51 separate state-level elections. Now, to be clear, these elections are purely democratic. However, it can be confusing if you are not careful. And this is true for 2 reasons. Number one, as I mentioned, these elections are carried out at the state level. That's why there's 51. One for each of the 50 states and another for Washington, D.C. And what that means is that the overall number of ballots cast for a particular candidate is essentially irrelevant. It is perfectly possible, even plausible, that a candidate can get more votes cast in their favor in November and not become the president of the United States. This has happened more than once in our nation's history, most recently in 2016, when technically more votes were cast in Hillary Clinton's favor than in the favor of the Republican candidate Donald Trump at this time. And yet, the Democrat candidate Hillary Clinton did not go on to become president of the United States. Now, let's be careful here. Because of this, you will hear some people say that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. That's not what I just told you. In fact, that is a factual inaccuracy. Hillary Clinton did not win the popular vote in 2016. In fact, nobody has ever won the popular vote to be president of the United States because we've never actually had that system. The Electoral College is in the Constitution. It's been here since the beginning, and so we have never had, and short of a constitutional amendment, we will never have an actual popular vote to decide who the president will be at the national level. These are state-level elections. They are purely democratic, but they operate at the state level. So that a vote cast in New Mexico has no consequences for a vote cast in Oklahoma. Or votes cast in Oklahoma have no consequences for the results of the election in New Mexico, or New York, or New Jersey, or California, or Florida, or Washington, or Texas. Each state's election is purely insular, an election comprised of voters who live in that state trying to decide which of the candidates seeking the presidency that state is going to support, and in a couple of cases, to what extent. Now, to explain what I mean when I say in a couple of cases to what extent, here's what I want you to understand. In all of these states, except for 2, The November elections operate on a winner-takes-all system. In other words, whichever candidate gets the most votes from voters in that state in November will almost always wind up getting all of that state's support in the next step of this process. Why? How does this work? Well, in general, understand that every state gets a certain number of electors, representatives in the Electoral College, who will ultimately select the president during the December phase of this process. The number of electors that each state receives is equal to its total delegation in Congress. So every state gets 2 electors for the Senate, because remember, every state, regardless of population, has exactly 2 senators. By the way, that's going to be relevant momentarily when we start to talk about some of the arguments for and against the system. Every state automatically starts with 2 for the Senate, but then they get an additional elector for each of their House representatives. So for example, the state of Oklahoma has a population of about 4.5 million people. That means that it gets exactly 5 representatives in the United States House. And so it gets 5 electors for its House delegation, plus 2 more for its Senate delegation, giving the state of Oklahoma a total of 7 electors. Now, you may be wondering why I have specifically chosen Oklahoma. It wasn't an accident. I've chosen Oklahoma so that I can make a comparison to the largest and most populous state, which is California. See, Oklahoma has about 4.5 to 5 million people. California has just over 10 times as many people, somewhere between 45 and 50 million. And because California's population is 10 times the size of Oklahoma's population, California gets 10 times as many representatives in the United States House. But you will note that it does not get 10 times as many electors in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the group of individuals made up of these electors chosen by each state to represent that state in the December election. So Oklahoma has 7 electors who are part of the Electoral College, which is ultimately made up of 538 individuals. That's going to be 435 for the representatives of the House, plus 100 for the Senate, an additional 3 for Washington, D.C., giving us 538 electors. Again, 7 of them are coming from Oklahoma. But what about California? Well, California gets 55. Now, 55 is definitely a much bigger number than 7. So during the second phase in the presidential selection process, California is going to have substantially more votes, 55, than Oklahoma, which only gets 7. But remember, California has more than 10 times as many people as Oklahoma. And so if we wanted this to be proportional, such that a vote cast in a smaller state like Oklahoma was equal to the value of a vote cast in a large state like California, then California should not have just 55 electoral votes to Oklahoma's 7, but 70. So by including the Senate in the calculation, deciding how many representatives that a state will get in the Electoral College, how many electors it will get to select, how many votes it will get to cast during the December phase of this process, the framers were deliberately biasing the results in favor of voters from smaller states. Keep that in the back of your mind. It's going to be relevant before we're done. Okay, but the bottom line here is that every single state gets a certain number of electors. It could be 55, it could be 7, but those electors are going to be chosen depending on the results of the November election for that state. So on this map, you can see that, for example, New Mexico on this map is blue. Now, based on its share of national population, New Mexico gets 3 House representatives and an additional 2 senators for a total of 5 electoral votes, 5 electors. Now, The state here is coded blue because the fact of the matter is that in this last election, the Democrat candidate got more votes in New Mexico's popular vote during the November election than did the Republican. And so it was the Democrats, the party of the candidate who got the most votes in that state, they got to choose all 5 of those electors. Lo and behold, you will not be surprised to learn that in the next step of this process, the December phase of the election, when those electors come together and each cast one ballot, all 5 of New Mexico's electors supported the Democratic candidate. Which is actually somewhat concerning and alarming if you really think about it very carefully. Why might this be concerning and alarming? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to guess that the Democrat candidate did not receive 100% of the vote from the people of New Mexico in November. Actually, I don't need to go out on a limb. I've looked up the statistics. It's about 56%, which is still a pretty decent lead, but what that means is that Donald Trump got almost half, 44% of New Mexico's support during the November election. And yet, ultimately, in the December election, he received 0 votes from New Mexico. So if you were one of the people in New Mexico who cast your vote for Donald Trump, you got absolutely nothing in return for your effort. Conversely, you can see the state of Oklahoma is red. Well, that's because Donald Trump did win Oklahoma's popular vote, and so Donald Trump got to pick all 7 of Oklahoma's electors. Or, to be more accurate, the Republican Party, Donald Trump's party, got to pick those 7 electors. And so again, each of these states is using a winner-takes-all system, although, just because our country likes to be complicated, there are 2 exceptions. Well, all of the states, except for these 2 exceptions, use a winner-takes-all system in which the candidate winning the popular vote for the state as a whole gets to select through the candidate's party all of that state's votes, all of that state's electors. Maine and Nebraska have taken a different approach. Using the congressional district method, these states allocate 2 electoral votes to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote overall, to the candidate who gets more vote in that state than anyone else. And then there is 1 electoral vote which will be given to the popular vote winner in each of the congressional districts. For Maine, that is 2. In Nebraska, it's 3. So what's really happening in Maine and Nebraska is that you have multiple popular vote contests, some being conducted at large for the state as a whole, and others being conducted in district for certain parts of the state. And this can, and historically has on some occasions, led to a split in which some of the votes go to the Republican candidate and some of the votes go to the Democrat candidate. But those 2 states are the exception. Every other state uses a winner-takes-all system, and so does Washington, D.C. And this, we will see, has some really big consequences. This is a big part of, by the way, the reason why I told you it's not accurate to say that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, that we don't know what would happen if there was a popular vote. One argument against the Electoral College that I'd like you to note is that it diminishes voter turnout. And by the way, this is empirically true. We know that it does diminish voter turnout, particularly among the members of each state's minority party. So if you are a Republican in New Mexico, for example, you know that the Republican candidate is almost certainly not going to get more votes than the Democrat candidate in your state as a whole. And what that means is that they're probably not going to get to select through their party any of New Mexico's electors, and you might as well just stay home if that's the only election you care about. Or conversely, if you are a Democrat in the state of Oklahoma, you might as well stay home. Because although you can go and vote for a Democrat candidate, that candidate's almost certainly not going to win the popular vote for the state of Oklahoma as a whole. Like, to put this into perspective, Donald Trump won every single one of Oklahoma's 77 counties by a pretty substantial margin in that last round of elections that he participated in for 2024. So the Democrats knew from the beginning that however many votes their candidate got in Oklahoma, they weren't going to hit the majority. And so they weren't going to get anything in return for their efforts. And lo and behold, just like Republican turnout in New Mexico, Democrat turnout in Oklahoma was really, really low because lots of voters only really pay attention to or care about presidential elections. And it doesn't take a genius to know that if you're a Democrat in Oklahoma or a Republican in New Mexico, you're probably wasting your time to show up and vote just for the president. Now, there's some other important elections usually on the ballot at the same time. Pay attention to that. I'm not telling you not to vote, but hopefully you get the picture. Okay, so that's the November phase. Each state has a purely popular vote. And at the end of that state's popular vote, the party of the candidate who got the most votes in the state as a whole will pick that state's electors. And the number of electors depends on the number of representatives and senators that state has in the United States Congress. Now, at the end of this process, we know who our 538 electors are. Again, 435 for the House, 100 for the Senate, and 3 more for Washington, D.C. The next step in the process is for each of those electors to cast one ballot on who they want to be the next president. In general, if you are a Republican from Oklahoma and the Republican candidate won your state's popular vote so that you were selected by the Republican Party, you're probably going to vote for the Republican candidate. Or conversely, if you're a Democrat from New Mexico or California. Okay, so we know that's pretty straightforward. But one thing that might surprise you is that technically, at the federal level, there is no law which says you have to vote for the candidate of your party, the candidate who won your state's popular vote. And so this is another concern that many people have with the Electoral College. Every election cycle, or mostly every election cycle, we are going to encounter a handful of what we call faithless electors. These are electors who vote against their party's candidate, against the candidate who won the popular vote in their state. And theoretically, technically, it is possible that if enough electors defected, they could change the outcome of the election. If there were enough faithless electors, that could result in a change in outcome, a change in who the next president will be. However, one thing I will note is that this concern seems to be more a question of principle than actual reality. We usually get a handful of faithless electors who cast protest votes that don't affect the outcome of an election, but we have basically never, in fact, I don't need to say basically, we have never seen enough faithless electors to actually alter the outcome of the election, and I'm not sure that we ever will. We might, never say never, but you get the point one more time. Okay, now here's a really important thing. Each elector can cast exactly one vote. And what that means is that in order to win, you're going to need at least 270 electors to vote for you. Why 270? Well, that's the majority. And the Constitution says that getting more votes than any other candidate is not enough. You have to get more than half. Now, if there are only and exactly 2 candidates in the election, then it is guaranteed that whichever candidate gets the most votes has the majority and becomes president. But there have been times in our country's history, albeit not very recently, when you have more than 2 candidates securing electoral votes. And if you split the vote 3 ways, it may be that nobody gets 270. Maybe one candidate gets 100 and another candidate gets 260. Well, that puts us at 360 votes between those 2 candidates, and the remaining candidate is going to wrap up what's left. 538 minus 360 gives us 178. So the end results are that candidate A got 100 votes, candidate B got 178 votes, and candidate C got 260 votes. Nobody's gotten 270, so nobody can be declared the winner. In these cases, the election is thrown through the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives has to pick from the top 3 candidates who they think the next president should be. It doesn't have to be the candidate who got 260 votes. It could be the candidate who got 100 votes. Or perhaps they compromise, picking the candidate who came in second place with only 178 votes. But here's the bottom line of how this process works. During phase 1 of the presidential election process, on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, voters gather around to decide which of the candidates for president their state is going to support by casting ballots for the candidate whose party they want to choose their state's electors or representatives in the Electoral College. After that, each state appoints the winner's electors to the Electoral College on a winner-takes-all basis, with the 2 exceptions we mentioned previously. Once those electors have been selected, they meet at the respective capitals of their states to vote on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. And then, if a candidate has gotten at least 270 votes, that candidate becomes the president-elect. Not the president, the president-elect. The president-elect is the person who has won the election, but not yet sworn their oath of office. This is not an official position. The president-elect is the incoming president, which means that provided nothing radical or weird happens, they don't have an aneurysm and pass away after December, but before swearing their oath of office, that person will eventually become the president. But that doesn't happen until January. In January, we have a joint session of Congress, during which the House and Senate come together. They open and count the votes cast by the Electoral College, and then certify the results. Once the results have been certified, they schedule a ceremony for the president to be sworn into office. This swearing in takes place at the end of January. And once the president has sworn the oath of office, he is, in fact, the president. Before swearing the oath of office, president-elect is the more accurate term. After, president. Before swearing oath, no power. After, power. Okay, so that's what the process looks like. But why? Because this is really complicated. And as we've seen, there are some problems with it. We've already seen that it reduces voter turnout. We've already seen that it creates the possibility that faithless electors could actually change the outcome of the election. And again, there's no federal law to stop that. There are some states that fine faithless electors, but who wouldn't be willing to pay a fine, even a very steep fine, if it meant they got to pick the next president of the United States? And so there are some concerns, but we're really only just touching at the tip of the iceberg here. As it turns out, there are a substantial number of people in our country who want to reform or obliterate the Electoral College altogether. We've talked about 2 of the arguments why you might want to get rid of the Electoral College, but we're not yet done. I'd also like you to note that the Electoral College is deeply confusing. Many people don't understand what they're voting for, and that can dissuade voters from participation, even if they are a member of their state's majority party. Furthermore, the system is simply and deeply undemocratic. It was intentionally designed to favor voters from small states at the expense of voters from large states. And to understand why the framers would design this type of system, we need to take a step back. And I'm going to explain this first historically, and then by making a case wherein I explain some of the reasons why the Electoral College might be a good thing in spite of the problems that we've already highlighted. You've heard the arguments against it. Get ready to hear the arguments for it. So first, understand that the Electoral College is in the Constitution. And like most things in our Constitution, it was not exactly what anybody expected when they showed up on day 1 of the Constitutional Convention, but rather it was a compromise that resulted from a controversy when delegates in attendance representing very different types of state proposed radical alternatives. The original draft of the Constitution was authored by James Madison and was called the Virginia Plan. Remember, Virginia is a very big state. Now, what the Virginia Plan proposed for presidential elections was a pure popular vote carried out at the national level. Candidates run for office. The candidate who receives the most votes wins. Now, Madison was being very strategic because he was from a very large state. And he knew that in this purely popular vote system, the denizens, the citizens, the people who lived in those big states would always have an advantage and could, in essence, pick whoever they wanted to be the president of the United States, completely ignoring the small states. That was part of the intention. It's not all of it. Another really important point here is that for Madison, that was a just arrangement. It wasn't just convenient, it was appropriate. Of course, states with more people should have more power. The individuals in our government represent people wherever they live. You shouldn't preferentially favor those from rural areas over big states, at least not in the opinion of Madison. But the small state delegates were shrewd, and they realized that that would put them in a very precarious position. They realized that if they went along with this, that they would be at the mercy of the larger states, who by virtue of their numbers would already have a majority in the House of Representatives, would also have a substantial minority in the Senate, and now they would get to control the presidency every single time. And so the small states said no. There were some discussions about alternatives, like a parliamentary system similar to what exists in the United Kingdom, in which the chief executive is not a president, but a prime minister, is not elected by a popular vote, but selected from the legislature by its own members. So if we did this, for example, we might use the Senate, and the president would be a senator selected by a popular vote of everybody else in the Senate. And that president would serve at the leisure of the Senate, although he, or maybe one day she, would be called a prime minister. If the prime minister offended the Senate, they could call a new vote and replace him. If he kept them happy, they could keep him in power. This obviously wasn't going to fly. Remember principles like separation of powers, checks and balances, so on and so forth, and the fact that we just fought a war to get away from the British government, and the framers knew that voters were never going to agree to recreate that government in the United States. So the real alternative to the popular vote becomes the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is, again, designed to systematically inflate the voice of voters from smaller, more sparsely populated parts of the country. Now, on one level, this is just power politics. It's just interests. Small states wanted more say, and big states also wanted more say. But if it were just that, then neither side ever would have given any ground. We wouldn't have gotten either a popular vote or an electoral college. The Constitutional Convention would have crumbled. But we didn't. We got an electoral college. Why? Well, because it turns out there are actually some really good arguments for why the Electoral College is actually a positive if your goal is to create a president of the United States and not just the urban states. See, remember that metaphor from earlier in this lecture. Thomas Jefferson once compared a pure democratic system to two wolves and a sheep getting together to vote on what's for dinner. And if two wolves and a sheep get together and vote on what's for dinner, what's for dinner? It's the sheep. That's democratic, but it's not fair. And that's how the small states felt about the prospects of allowing the big states through sheer force of numbers to select every president. Because remember, the president has basically all of the power in the international arena. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The president is extremely important and very powerful. And they knew that this was going to be the case, and so they wanted to have a say. Now, they couldn't, of course, exclude the big states altogether. The big states would never, ever, ever agree to that. And so, instead, what actually winds up happening is that they compromise. And they create an electoral college, which makes it impossible for a candidate to win the presidency by going to all the big states and saying, hey, I will do whatever is in the interest of the big states, even if it comes at the expense of the small states. But without inflating the voice of voters from small states to such a degree that the opposite could happen. And a president could go just to the small states and tell those voters, hey, if you elect me, I'll do whatever you want and completely ignore or even exploit and oppress the big states. No, 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 no. The Electoral College was designed so that mathematically it is impossible to win without support from a combination of big and small states, and it is impossible to win with just one region or portion of the country, because they did not want a president of the urban states or the northwestern states or the southern states, but of the United States. And so the primary reason why we wind up with an electoral college is to promote regional coalition building. There are other factors you should know and be aware of. The framers were suspicious of too much democracy. They wanted people to have a voice, but they feared mob rule, and the Electoral College and the fact that members of the Electoral College can be faithless electors if they choose was meant to be a check on the popular will. But the number one most important point to understand is that the Electoral College originates as an attempt to promote regional coalition building so that presidential elections don't turn into a fight pitting big states versus small states or vice versa. Northern states versus southern states, or vice versa. And by the way, by and large, it has worked. To promote these regional coalitions and, part and parcel to this, prevent a tyranny of the majority, in which 51% of the population living in just one or two very urban states or one or two very urban areas could, through sheer force of numbers, vote to elect a president that would enslave the other 49% more sparsely spread out across different broad regions. And we can see this when we start to realize that about 50 or 51% of the American population lives in just these four states: New York, California, Texas, and Florida. And by the way, if you're looking at it at the state level, this actually underestimates how overwhelming the advantage of urban voters would be if we had a national popular vote, wherein the candidate who gets the most ballots cast with their name checked always wins the presidency. Because within those states, you're going to find huge margins live in the most populated city. So for example, if you look at the state of New York, it is one of the four most populated states in the country. But about half of its people, somewhere between 45 and 60%, depending on whether you're including the wider metropolitan area, suburbs, and things like that, live just in New York City. And the wants, needs, and interests of people in New York City, which is represented by AOC, one of the only open socialists in the entire United States House of Representatives, and that recently elected a radical socialist mayor who has proudly declared that he would like to abolish private property in the city, whose housing director says that that process of abolishing private property would begin by targeting white home and property owners in the city, are not the same as the wants, needs, and interests of America as a whole. And we see something similar with California, although it's not quite so drastic. In California, you're going to have something like 30% of the population living in just one city. And the numbers go on to go down a bit, but by and large, what we find is that if you say, broke this down at the county level, you would see the real disparity. There are about 146 counties that have been shaded in blue on this map. And they only make up a very small portion of the geographic distribution of our country's territory. They are hyper-urbanized, and yet, because they are hyper-urbanized, what we're going to find is that about 51% of our nation's population lives just in these blue shaded counties. And if you live in one of these hyper-urbanized areas, you're going to have a unique set of especially economic wants, needs, interests, and expectations of government. And so if we have a popular vote system and you live in one of these areas, you're in a really good position. You're basically always going to have your needs, your wants, your needs, your expectations met by the president. But if you are a part of the 49% that live in the gray shaded counties, the vast majority of counties, you're in trouble. You're not really going to have much of a voice. And so the question becomes, why continue being a part of this process at all? How do we convince these people in the gray areas to continue agreeing to be governed by individuals selected by voters in the blue areas? Well, maybe we can't, or maybe the answer is to adopt the Electoral College. To demonstrate this, let's look at what happened in the 2016 election. Let's start with the popular votes received by each candidate. As you can see on this slide, Hillary Clinton received about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump at 65,537,110 ballots cast in her favor, compared to Donald Trump's 62,859,071. Yet Donald Trump did go on to become the president, securing 306 electoral votes during the December phase, compared to Hillary Clinton's modest 232. Now, at first glance, this seems deeply unfair, and maybe it is. It's certainly not democratic. But one thing you might notice if you look very carefully at this map is that outside of the coasts, Hillary Clinton got very little support, whereas Donald Trump was able to secure the presidency because he built a broad cross-regional coalition, combining voters from small states in common cause with voters from large states. Yes, he got a large number, the majority of small states. Places like Oklahoma and Tennessee definitely liked Donald Trump more than places like Washington, Oregon, New York, or California. However, he also secured a couple of very large states, including, for example, Florida or Pennsylvania, a state that last voted for a Republican in the 1980s when it supported Ronald Reagan. Now, let's go a step further. Let's see what this number would look like if we were to drop California out of the equation. Well, that wouldn't be fair. We shouldn't exclude California altogether. The framers obviously wouldn't have wanted that, but let's look at how it changes the results. Hillary Clinton goes from winning by about 3 million to losing by about 2 million votes. In other words, Hillary Clinton's entire winning margin and then some came purely from the state of California, which does not represent the country's overall interests. What's in the best interest of California, what voters from California want, need, or expect from government, and what the country as a whole want, need, or expect from government aren't going to be the same thing. And so a pure popular vote system could be really problematic, because the sheer volume of individuals living in California, at least right now, this is changing, but the sheer number of people living in California right now basically guarantees that whoever wins California's popular vote has such a head start that they're guaranteed the presidency, or close to guaranteed. Let's not overstate it completely. However, if you can build a coalition from across the different regions, what you're going to find is that under the Electoral College, you can actually win. And that means that, again, you can't just promise to do what's in the best interest of voters from highly urbanized coastal states like California, which was the strategy of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Instead, you have to mimic what was the strategy of Donald Trump in that same election year. Donald Trump adopted some issue positions that were deeply popular in small states but deeply unpopular in urban states, like, for example, supporting the construction of a border wall along the frontier with Mexico. But the opposite is also true. He also, notoriously, endorsed the use of eminent domain. If you don't know what that means, Google it. It's an important major policy issue, but it's not too important for our purposes here. Just understand that eminent domain, while largely popular in very urban areas, is largely unpopular in more rural areas. So what's going on? Why is Donald Trump giving with one hand and taking with the other, pandering to small state voters on one issue and big state voters on the other issue? Well, he's trying to build a coalition, because he knows, strategically speaking, that under the Electoral College, it's not possible to win the presidency with just the 4 largest states, as it might be on a popular vote system, or with just the smaller states. Instead, you will need a coalition of both. Now, the obvious counter is to say that in the Electoral College system, you don't actually need to win entire regions. Technically, that's true. Instead, you just need to win a handful of swing states. And again, technically that's true, but it's misleading. Because what we're going to find is that the particular swing states in a specific election can change from one cycle to the next. And that over the years, literally every single region of the country has been represented in the list of swing states at least some point in the past. Now, of course, if you're from somewhere like Oklahoma, you're excluded from that. But New Mexico is a swing state. Didn't always used to be a swing state. It is now. Or similarly, you can look at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was considered a swing state in 2008. And again, Pennsylvania became a swing state in 2012. It was a swing state in 2016. But in the last election cycle, not so much. Or rather, a better example, Florida. The first round for Donald Trump, that was a swing state. But 2024, we knew who was going to win Florida. So the swing states aren't a static list. They change. Some states become swing states multiple times in short periods, some don't, but they're very diverse, representing all of the major regions of our country, representing majority Republican and majority Democrat states, representing highly urban and highly rural areas. And so again, the Electoral College, for better or worse, actually seems to be working as intended, preventing a tyranny of the majority, in which one hyper-populated portion of the country or one densely populated set of states gets to select the president, and in which candidates must instead draw support from at least some big states and some small states, never ignoring or exploiting one for the other's benefit. All right, let's close it up with a look at the other type of federal election, the congressional election. I say the other type, by the way, I actually ought to be a little more specific. There are two types of election that take place in Congress: House elections and Senate elections. Now, I'm not going to go here into all of the differences between House and Senate elections, although you do need to be prepared to answer questions about these because they will be covered in your textbook and elsewhere. But, by and large, here's the big picture. Members of the House of Representatives serve short 2-year terms and are up for election simultaneously, which means that every other year, every member of the House of Representatives is on the chopping block. And it is theoretically possible that every single one of these members could be kicked out of office simultaneously. Whereas in the Senate, we have very long 6-year terms. If you are elected to the Senate in, say, 2034, you will not be back on the ballot until 2040. If you're elected in 2030, in 2036, you've got to run again. But that gives you a pretty long time to rest on your laurels. And if you make some controversial decisions early on in your career, voters are probably going to forget about them before you're on the chopping block. So you might get away with prioritizing what you think is long-term good policy over what happens to be popular among your voters in a given cycle. Not so with the House members. They're for election every other year. People can remember what you did last year when you're on the ballot this year. Similarly, the 100 senators are not all up for re-election, are not all on the chopping block simultaneously. Instead, you should note Senate elections are staggered, meaning that at any given moment, you will never have an opportunity to replace more than 33 or 34 senators in a single election cycle. So if, for example, we have 3 classes of senators, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Class 1 might get elected in, let's say, 2030. Then, in 2032, Class B gets elected. Then, in 2034, Class C gets elected. In 2036, Class A is on the chopping block. In 2038, Class B is on the chopping block. And then in 2040, Class C is on the chopping block. So as you can see, you're only really going to have about 1/3 of the Senate on the chopping block, up for re-election at any given moment. And so that means that the Senate is much more insulated from public opinion, and especially short-term trends or panics in public opinion. This isn't an accident. I want you to understand that the framers designed the House of Representatives to provide what we call delegate representation, which you should remember involves members of an elected assembly, government officials, making decisions based more or less entirely on the preferences of their voters. In other words, the House is supposed to be our voice in government. Members of the House are there to be middlemen. They take instructions. They act like delivery men. We attach an address that might say higher taxes for better social programs, or lower taxes and protect our economic freedoms. And if we say higher taxes, they say how high. If we say lower taxes, they say how low can we go. Their personal opinions on whether this is wise or foolish in the long term are irrelevant, because if they don't give us what we want, they're back on the chopping block next year and we'll fire them. But, by contrast, senators serve 6-year terms, and they are not all up on the chopping block simultaneously, which means that the Senate can ignore what is popular in the interest of what is good policy over time more frequently than the House. Now, we can't take that to the extreme. They can't ignore it altogether, but they can instead focus on providing what we call trustee representation. And trustee representation is when elected officials are selected because we trust them to exercise expert judgment on our behalf. We trust them to put politics aside and focus on good policy, even if that means telling us no every once in a while. Then they need enough time for their no to carry out its consequences. We can look to see if, hey, they were right after all, and we've benefited from them saying no. We didn't like it at the time, but it turns out it was a good idea. If we'd gotten our way, we'd be worse off. Then we can assess, not based on how well they followed instructions, but on how well they governed, whether their policies have effectively implemented positive changes in our lives or negative changes. So why are House and Senate elections different? House elections make their members deeply vulnerable and therefore incentivize delegate representation, whereas Senate elections insulate their members, and therefore what we're going to find is that they promote trustee representation. However, there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and it also has to do with differences in House and Senate elections. To be more specific, I want to talk about what we call redistricting and gerrymandering. Now, I want you to understand that senators are elected at large because their job is to represent entire states. In fact, until the 17th Amendment, they weren't selected by popular vote. They were selected by each state's legislature. And their job was not to represent the people of that state per se, but the government of that state's overall collective interests. Now, that's not true today. They are popularly elected, but they are elected at large. So, for example, if you are in the state of Oregon, it doesn't matter whether you live in Orlando or anywhere else, whether you're in the north, south, east, or west. Everybody in Oregon is a serial killer, and all of the serial killers has the opportunity to vote to decide who should represent them every time a Senate seat comes up for re-election. Or if you are, say, in Oklahoma. If you're in the state of Oklahoma, it doesn't matter if it's Oklahoma City or Tulsa, Durant or McAllister. Every Oklahoman gets to vote to decide who Oklahoma's senators are going to be. But if you want to decide who represents Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, that's different. You have to live in Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, which, if you don't know, I'm assuming most of you don't, is basically the entire south and east portion of the state, outside of Tulsa. Well, the representative for that district is an individual by the name of Josh Brecheen, as of recording this video. That could change in the near future, and then I'll have to re-record, perhaps, but only people who actually live in Josh Brecheen's district will get to decide whether he keeps his job. Now, the issue here is that under the Supreme Court ruling of Baker versus Carr, all of the districts within any given state have to have approximately equal population. In general, that means that every district's going to need to have about 435,000 voters. And this can be an issue because the places where large populations reside vary and change over time. Populations in certain parts of a state might grow or shrink based on immigration or emigration. They might grow or shrink based on birth rates and death rates and a whole host of other factors. And so periodically, the boundaries of congressional districts in each state have to be redrawn. This is, by the way, why we have a census written into the United States Constitution. Every 10 years, the federal government conducts a census to figure out how many people are living in which parts of our country. That data is then forwarded to each state for the purposes of redistricting. And redistricting is when the state government uses census data to redraw the boundaries of each of its congressional districts so that each of these districts has approximately the same number of people. And you don't wind up with a situation where, for example, you have one district with 10 million voters and another district with 10 voters. It wouldn't be fair to let 10 people amongst themselves share one representative, while right next door you have 1 million people who also are sharing just one representative. It's a part of a principle called one person, one vote, and again, it comes from Baker versus Carr. Now, redistricting itself is a challenge. This is not easy. It's also handled at the state level and not really controversial. Basically, everyone agrees that, yeah, we should periodically redraw these boundaries to reflect changes in population. And this needs to be done at least at the House level. It doesn't need to be done for the Senate, because remember, senators are elected by the states at large and not in district. But for the House, we have to periodically redraw these boundaries. Here's where things start to get a little bit sticky and controversial. As it turns out, redistricting just redraws boundaries to reflect changing in population. However, gerrymandering is the process of dividing up and redrawing districts to give a particular demographic of voters an advantage over others. Now, there are many types of gerrymandering that we can talk about. One type, for example, is racial gerrymandering. For the last several decades, the United States has selectively gerrymandered in order to inflate the voice of black voters and deflate the voice of white voters as a part of a program that, at least in theory, at least on paper, is designed to empower historically disenfranchised demographics, African Americans. However, the Supreme Court has recently told us that that's not acceptable. And so again, there are different types of gerrymandering, like racial gerrymandering, but to be clear, usually when you hear people complaining about gerrymandering, they're not talking about racial gerrymandering. They're not talking about gerrymandering to allow historic communities to stay together in a single district. They're talking about partisan gerrymandering, which is when you redraw the boundaries of your district to give a particular political party an advantage over another. Now, the extent to which gerrymandering actually works is contested in the academic literature. But we do know that people in state governments attempt to gerrymander districts, and in some cases, as is the instance with, for example, Gavin Newsom in California, it is very flagrant. They don't try to hide it. They deliberately admit and acknowledge in public forums, yes, we want to redraw the districts to give our party an advantage, not necessarily to represent the people, not necessarily to reflect changes in demographics or population patterns, but to give our party an advantage over the other side, over the enemy, so to speak. And this is possible because gerrymandering, and in fact the entire redistricting process, as I've mentioned already, occurs at the state level. Each state gets to draw its own boundaries. But remember, the Constitution also guarantees every single state in the Union a Republican form of government, which means that the people in those governments are all elected officials selected by the voters. And, of course, we know that the most important predictor of who wins or loses in an election, of who you vote for, is political party. And so if you're in a state that is generally dominated by Democrats, like let's say New Mexico, or a state that is generally dominated by Republicans, like let's say Texas, then what we're going to find is that the Democrats will have an advantage when it's time to draw the boundaries in New Mexico, and the Republicans in Texas. And so there's a temptation, again, to use this power to put yourself and your allies in a position of authority, because that's what political parties exist to do. They exist to help their members get elected. And what do those members want? What is the number one goal of an elected official? David Mayhew tells us it's to get reelected. So it makes sense to draw boundaries that will help you and your allies stay in power, get things done, and achieve your goals with as little interruption from the other side as possible. So that's gerrymandering. But as it turns out, again, gerrymandering is quite difficult. And there are at least two major strategies that can be used for gerrymandering. There's what we call packing. And packing is a gerrymandering strategy in which district lines are drawn to pack an opposing party's voters into as few districts as possible, filling those districts with large and wasteful majorities to ensure easy electoral victories in other districts. Since each district only gets one representative, the fewer districts the opponents control, the fewer seats they can win. Cracking, on the other hand, involves redrawing the lines of congressional districts, not to concentrate your opponents into as few districts as possible, essentially sacrificing those districts so that you can gain neighboring districts, but rather redrawing those lines to dilute and divide your opponent's voting blocks, to divide and spread out the other party's voters across as many districts as possible, so that they are so loosely dispersed and so widespread that they are unable to form a majority in any particular district. Now, you might ask, Why do we allow this? And it turns out that we allow this because it's extremely hard to stop. Nobody's really found out a good way to combat gerrymandering. Because the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what do we want our districts to look like? For example, one goal in redrawing boundaries might be to create more competitive elections. We know this increases representation. We know that this makes people more engaged and likely to participate in the process, but it might also not be particularly representative. If you have a state like Oklahoma, for example, where 77 out of 77 counties voted for Donald Trump in the last round of elections that they participated in, well, you're going to find that if you're creating competitive districts, you are deliberately disadvantaging the Republican majority. If, on the other hand, you're in a Democrat majority state and you are drawing districts to help Republicans win elections, that's not very democratic. So your desire to promote competition can conflict with your desire to provide accurate proportional representation. Or similarly, think about the majority-minority districts, those districts that were gerrymandered, deliberately deflating the voice of white voters to empower black voters as a way of allowing minority populations that you feel have been historically disenfranchised to stand up for themselves and have a voice. Well, minority empowerment might be a very good thing, but in this case, again, it comes at the consequence of other values. Now, I'm not telling you whether any of this is good or bad, but on this slide, I've listed some of the values that we generally agree are positive characteristics in drawing the boundaries of congressional districts, but that frequently come into conflict with one another. Competitiveness, minority empowerment, compactness, preservation of existing community divisions, preservation of partisan voting blocks, proportional representation, and compactness. I'll let you do your own independent research on these ideas. Of course, keep up with your reading and all of that. But for now, we are done with this lecture.